So we kind of all have this innate sense that we exist inside of our bodies and it's separate from the outside world, right? So um, basically, that's because you understand that no one can read minds. And that's a bit of a lonely existence to think about the fact that you're kind of trapped inside your head. And even in the most intimate relationship, long term committed, relationship, you can still feel lonely because that person can't be in there with you. So, we're going to start with just a quick understanding of the black box, the brain, the mind interface, and then we're going to talk about interest as a human emotion. And so, first off, what you need to understand is that the black box is what we refer to in psychology. It's the mind, basically. And B.F. Skinner popularized that term. And essentially, it's called the black box because no one can see inside another person's head. So, unfortunately, psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, all of that has primarily focused on the brain rather than the mind. And that is because there's no way to scientifically validate certain research that you do on someone's mind. Like, you have to rely on self-report. If you ask somebody, how are you feeling right now, you have to believe that A, they're telling you the truth, and B, that they're telling their own selves the truth. And a lot of people have a hard time figuring out what it is that they're feeling. I mean, this is what forms the crux of all self-defeating behavior and emotional dysfunction. And so, just as an aside, Dr. Lukens created a method of therapy and of life coaching that helps us understand what's going on inside people's heads without having to rely on self-report. And no, that doesn't mean that we've figured out how to read minds, but we've come pretty darn close in that we kind of understand how to predict human behavior. And that includes thoughts, patterns, and emotions and all of that, based on his model, which was a 1,200-page theoretical psychological book. So we'll start off here real quick with the black box, and I'll explain something to you. So one, the black box is, opaque, aka we can't read minds, right? You can't see into the black box. But what Dr. Lucan's method does is it basically takes down, let's say, the opacity of the box so that you can kind of see into it. So that's what I can do as a CICT or CICC coach. And you'll notice through the black box now we've got the mind, and that's this little swirly liquid red and blue thing here. And really what that is that Dr. Lukens has proven with physics that the mind adheres to the laws of fluid dynamics, that the mind can be studied scientifically. There's a way to do it. He lays it out in his book. That's neither here nor there. But what you need to understand is sometimes not only is it hard for other people to see inside your head, right? Or they can't do it at all. Sometimes we actually make it hard for ourselves to see inside our own heads. We do that on purpose because sometimes there's painful stuff inside of our mind. And that doesn't just mean like emotional trauma from your childhood and etc. It could be like, I don't like this behavior that I keep exhibiting, and it is so shameful to me. I've never shared it with anyone. It's whether it's taboo or it's toxic or self-defeating, whatever it is, I might not like it about myself. And so maybe I have 5 or 6 of those different things. And so it's easier for me to spend time not looking at it. So how do I do that? Well, the brain and the mind interface here. This is essentially where people get it wrong. They think the brain is in charge of everything, when in reality it's not. It's a very intricate dance between the mind and the brain together. But the brain doesn't do anything on its own, and it's not the end-all be-all of our behavior. So you can't just whittle things down to the chemicals, the neurochemicals that are in your brain at any given time. So, and I have another video on that, and it focuses on ADHD, but really what I explain is that just because there are certain hormones and certain synapses in the brain does not mean that the mind is doing what you think it should be doing just because the brain is exhibiting certain things. And if you were to cut open a brain in an autopsy, you wouldn't find little printed pieces of paper with your social security number on it, or like a map of New Jersey or Florida or wherever you live, right? But we know that you know those things. And if someone were to die, let's say on the battlefield, and you were completely unaware of this war back a couple hundred years ago. You just found this body as an archaeologist. And, you could never, even if it was like perfectly preserved, let's say like a mummy, and you could dissect the brain, you would never know why the person died, or the fact that they died, trying to fight for freedom. So the mind is very tricky in that it's very elusive, very esoteric, very hard for us to understand. And on top of that, stuff exists in our mind that we don't like. So we like to stay outside in the outside world. So the first thing you need to understand is that humans are slow verbs. We're not nouns. Like if I point to a human, it's not a noun. It's not a thing. We are moving through time and space. So just like a plant, if you were to just put a plant, and you can find these videos on YouTube, you put a plant with like a time lapse on it, you could see that even without wind moving its leaves, the plant actually moves. It's just very, very slow. And over time, it moves because it itself is living out what it was intended to do. So we are doing that. We are verbing through life using the emotion of interest. So the emotion of interest is one of the emotions that drives us to do what we do. And essentially, someone who is the player type, right? They've got so much stuff going on inside the mind that they've made it too opaque. They've buried everything in their blind spots. And the way that they keep themselves occupied, because if they're left alone with their thoughts, is to direct their interest to the outside world. Now, everybody does this. Maybe the video game person, the person who's addicted to video games, or the person who's addicted to work or whatever, like they direct their interest outside of themselves, and they do it using a certain thing. And this person, right here, the player type, just so happens to enjoy using other people, and lots of them, to keep them busy. So that means that they're texting a bunch of people all the time. It means that they're, having sex. It means that they are not interested in like an actual one-on-one relationship. And do you want to know why? Because in a one-on-one relationship, you are required to go deep. And if I don't even go deep with my own self, why would I start directing my interest or my attention inward just for you? I don't even do it for me. It doesn't matter that it's causing me a lot of dysfunction and issues, and I'm never going to, I'm going to end up all alone one day. Why would I start directing my interest inward? I have to if I want to be in a long-term committed relationship, because two people coming together to form an intimate relationship must have an intimate relationship with themselves first. They have to. At least a successful and fulfilling and thoroughly love-based relationship. And yeah, there are people that have stayed married to each other for decades, and it's really only out of obligation, not out of real, intimate knowledge of the self and each other. So when you look at a player type, you're looking at someone who all his arrows are pointing outside of the self. There are no arrows going in. He's not doing introspection. He's certainly not journaling or anything. So now you've got you over here. Women in general, and males who have more of a dominant female energy, they are more introspective. And just think about how women developed over time. If we were made to stay at home and teach kids, it meant that we were communicating a lot more than men were, because they were out doing, yard work and hunting and fighting and all of that. So a lot less communication going on. And we as humans develop through our language, through our communications. So if anything, women were left alone to teach children and talk to each other. So that created some sense of growth in the self, emotionally speaking. And then on top of that, we also did not have, we had more time to be introspective. I mean, we were taught how to needlepoint. It was required that women knew how to knit, So what are you doing when you're sitting there knitting? You're just sitting there with your head, you're thinking. So you're going inward. So we have developed more emotionally over time. So you might be interested in the player type, and let's say he has 0 arrows going inside. His interest is, he's not interesting inward at all. He's interesting outward to the outside world. And let's say, you don't journal every day and you go on Instagram more than you go on mental health apps. So let's say we'll give you bonus point here. You're a woman, you've got one arrow going inward, so you're introspective. The issue here is, why are you attracted to this type, Well, at some point, you're missing some arrows, right? You should be directing more attention inward. Someone who is thoroughly involved with the outside world seems interesting to you, because if their only arrows are pointing at you and at themselves, that's a healthy person, right? But if they're, you, themselves, their career, their passion, etc., there are a couple other things someone needs in order to be fulfilled. But if you think about how many arrows they have, like, girl 1, girl 2, girl 3, and you're over here and all you want is their arrows pointing at you, it's because it's on some level you are also trying to avoid what's going on in your head and your thoughts and, you and yours. This person keeps you occupied because now you have a challenge here where it's like, I want to be a strong magnet that gets all these arrows to bend towards me. But you see, the issue there is you find yourself, instead of, thinking about your job and, your next career move or your finances or, the book you've been saying you want to write, all your arrows are pointed towards him, trying to get all his arrows to point towards you. On some level, you are using him as an escape just as much as he's using all the other girls that he's, texting with or they're texting with. And you're expecting them to want to be with you. The issue there is, it's not a matter of be more interesting than the other girls he's interested in. That doesn't matter. It's not them that are doing the attracting. They just exist there, and whatever it is that they are doing for him, let's say on like a characteristic level, like, he likes girls that are XYZ, they look like this, whatever it is. In the end, they are just filling a slot that he already had open because his arrows were already pointing out. His attention was already directed outward of himself. So if you think about this arrow over here and how much attention you're giving to your own self, that means that your box is a little more opaque than his. Let's say maybe the average woman who doesn't do a lot of inner work kind of knows what her shit is. She knows what her blind spots are and stuff. And then you can never judge a person. I never know. This is just a generic, let's just say this is just a generic player. I'm going to go ahead and say he kind of knows what he's got going on inside, but it's like barely enough that, like, just the opacity here at 95% still can barely see what's going on in there. So you're a little more self-aware. He's not even interested in becoming self-aware. Your issue is you're not going to be interested in becoming even more self-aware yourself because all of your arrows are pointed towards him. If you've only got a certain, amount of interest, it's like a renewable source, like think of it like oil or whatever, energy. It's, you really only have as much as you were given. And if you're using all of it to try and attract somebody who is repelled from their own sense of inner self, their inner world, and I'm just going to write that over here. This is also called the metaphysical, and Dr. Lukens calls it the meaningful world, which is meaning making is a whole other lesson in itself, but that's like physics of emotioning course 401. So we'll get there eventually if you're following along with me. So this is the inner world, the metaphysical world, meaningful world, and exists for every human. It's the inside, and then we've got the outside world over here. So you're attracted to the player type for the very same reason he is the player type. You're just not interested in your own self and your own well-being. And now why? Well, it's a variety of things. It could be like, you've heard the term daddy issues. I hate that. I like to call it the father wound. So, it's a father wound, like dad was either emotionally unavailable or physically abusive. Or, barely there because of divorce. Tried his best, but it was still divorce. aka like dad made a choice to not be in my presence as a young child. And you can say, oh, well, he did his best. But yeah, that's not tell that to a 4-year-old. Daddy's doing his best when they're sobbing their eyes out and dad's not there. Have you ever talked to a 4-year-old and tried to rationalize to them why their parents are out of the room for a second? Like, yeah. So you're fooling yourself if you think that like you can talk to your inner child like that, so to speak. Your emotional fact for back then is what it is. So and you can also recreate this too if like, let's say mom was the dominant parent in your life and then she was also emotionally unavailable. So now you're just trying to seek validation from anybody and anything. So you're not going to be attracted to healthy people in the first place. But like someone whose arrows are constantly outside of the self are not healthy. Now, at least you might have, I mean, you're interested in this video. So you at least have some sense of, I want to do inner work. I'm interested in myself. And like girls love astrology and mental health and, you know, all of that. So it's very important that people understand that people who are females or have that natural female balance of energy are more introspective. But you're still doing the exact same thing that he's doing. And there's 40 million other things that could be driving this. And some of the biggest ones are the father wound, you know, your fear of loneliness, and, you know, maybe the dating pool. Maybe you're in a very, very small town and there's like 5 guys that meet your height requirement. 4 of them have jobs. And then 3 of them you're attracted to, and all 3 of them are players. And at the end of the day, you're like, I'm never getting out of this town and I don't want to be alone for the rest of my life. I would rather be with someone who makes me feel lonely in their presence than actually be by myself without someone. So, you know, loneliness can be another one. Now, like I said, lots of other reasons that I'll go into in another time, but the biggest thing that you need to understand from this video is that your behavior of, you know, wanting to be completely enamored with him and interested in him and want him to be attracted to you is the very same driver of escapism that is driving his behavior to want to stay outside of the self. So your job is to figure out what it is that's driving you to not want to be alone with yourself and why you'd rather settle for someone who like you have to fight to get their attention from. That's absurd. The idea here is to direct more of your self-love inward, more of your attention inward, be more interested in self-understanding. Why do I do what I do? What is my motivation in life? Why haven't I found my passion yet? Why am I attracted to guys like this? What did my parents instill in me that I need to unlearn? There's so much here, and you know, you'll find that if you just go journaling by yourself, you're not going to go digging very deep, because if you're lying to yourself in the first place about who you are and what you want, why do you think just putting it on paper is going to keep you, you know, from not telling the truth? So that's where truth mapping comes in, because it's a form of guided mental understanding and self-understanding. So it's like journaling, but it's on steroids, right? We give you the right questions to ask yourself. For instance, instead of asking you, you know, what lessons have you learned in life, which another journal might, you know, what lessons have you learned in life that have gotten you to where you're at right now? We would ask you, what lesson have you never learned? That's an invitation to look at your blind spots. That's an invitation to see if you even are aware of the things that are in your blind spot. And essentially over time, if you do more truth mapping, you'll get clearer and clearer and clearer on what's going on for you inside your mind, you know? And that's the goal, because the clearer you get that, and let's say the stuff inside the mind that you've been covering up, let's say past trauma, heartbreak, loneliness, etc. That stuff, when you start fixing that stuff, first you have to unblock it. Like first you have to know that it's there in order to fix it, right? Then you can start healing it one thing at a time. Then there's really less reasons to hide things from yourself, right? And when you have nothing to hide from yourself, you have very, very little interest. Like your interest outside of the self and into the outside world will be very low. Think about it. Why do monks go off into the mountains by themselves, like to live a life of isolation? Because they have found and cultivated some sense of enlightenment and interest in their own minds and their spiritual practice. And that means that they've almost tipped the scales in the complete opposite direction, which is like, I'm not even interested really in other humans. Now, that's not necessarily the goal if you're the type of person that wants to get married or wants to find someone long term. But what you need to understand is that the more you get enlightened about yourself, the more you will be attracted to that sense of being interested in just you. And like, nobody, no matter how hot they are or whatever it is that they are doing to attract you in the first place, if they aren't also working on themselves and being like self-reflective, you will find yourself not attracted to them naturally. It won't be like I'm attracted to this man, but I'm going to now make the decision not to pursue him because I know he's not good for me. No, you literally will be repulsed by those types of people. So your first step is to try and like figure out what are these things that are in your blind spots that are keeping you from wanting to cultivate that interest in you in the first place.